In this video, we are going to take a look at the RequireJS module loader. So RequireJS is one of the older and more mature module loaders that we can use, and it's one of those things that does one thing and does it well. So it doesn't have a whole lot of extraneous features that we will be dealing with some of the other module loaders we're going to take a look at. RequireJS is just a module loader. That's all it does. It has some plugin support, but we're not going to take a look at that. And it has excellent minification and bundling support as well, which we will take a look at for production builds. Now, RequireJS is an interesting one because it runs completely in the browser, with the exception of production builds. So during development, you will be using this entirely in the browser, which has some interesting consequences. In particular, you have to make sure that you tell RequireJS where all of your modules are so that it can load it. We will take a bigger look at how RequireJS knows where to grab your modules here in a moment when we plug this into our example application. So yeah, basically the process is we download RequireJS and we configure RequireJS, and then we tell it to launch our application. And that is it. So let's go ahead and take a look at that process using our awesome, really simple, straightforward example app. Okay, so what I've done is I've taken our example application, I've copied it over into a new folder, and I've ran npm install, which went out and installed all of our dependencies in npm. So if you downloaded the source code of the example application from this course, then you will have to use npm install to grab all of the required modules. So I'm going to go ahead and open up code, and then I'm going to jump over here and well, we can open up code here, and why is that open? I don't know. And the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure we get the RequireJS runtime into our application. Now, again, RequireJS runs it completely in the browser. Be very cognizant of that fact. So we are going to use the Bower package manager to grab RequireJS along with our jQuery and Lodash and jQuery UI dependencies. So let's go ahead and hop over into our editor, and I'm going to create a new file called bower.rc, so period bower.rc, which will tell Bower where to install our Bower packages. In this case, directory, and we're going to do public/lib. So Bower is going to install all of our packages into the public folder and then to a subfolder called lib, and that way our browser can access these files because they'll be served out by our HTTP server. So with that in place, let's hop back over into our command line window, and I'm going to quickly Bower init, and I'm just going to accept all the defaults for this. And then I'm going to go ahead and use Bower to download our dependencies. I'm going to say Bower install RequireJS. We need the RequireJS runtime. Again, this runs completely in your browser, so install RequireJS, and then our other dependencies. So jQuery, jQuery-UI, and then Lodash. And then I'm going to pass in save so that it gets saved. And that's not how you spell install, which is why that didn't quite work in the way that I had intended it to. But after correcting that little typo, we now have all of our awesome packages being dumped into our lib folder. So notice how it is installing it to public lib RequireJS because of our Bower.rc. Okay, so preemptively what I'm going to do is I'm going to, because we won't need our command line anymore, I'm going to start a second one, and then I'm going to hop into public and run our HTTP server. I'm going to go ahead and do that again because I already had something listening on port 8080. So this is going to be the error you're going to get, eAdder in use, if you try to start the HTTP server and you already have something listing on 8080. You can use HTTP server. You can tell it to change the port you want to listen on. If you're interested in that, you can see that in the docs. Anyway, now we are serving off of this folder. So let's go ahead and I'm going to pop open a Chrome window, and I'm going to locate that. So I'm going to go to localhost 8080 and refresh, and we see our awesome page. So I'll move this off to the side. Second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say gulp dev watch, so that gulp will be, actually no, not yet, because there's an interesting thing that we have to deal with in regards to that in a moment. So I'll move this off to the side. Okay, so now that we have RequireJS loaded, it's important to note that RequireJS is a AMD loader. So currently our application is Babel, our C, is writing everything in CommonJS. So we know that's CommonJS because of all these require statements and then our export statements as well in other modules that export things. So we're using CommonJS right now, but RequireJS really wants you to define things in AMD. Now, there are ways around that. There is this concept of a shim inside of RequireJS that we'll take a look at to require in non-AMD modules. But for now, we're going to be sticking with AMD modules. So I'm going to pop open our Babel RC, and I'm going to change the plugin here to use the proper modules plugin, the proper AMD module plugin, which, if you recall, is going to be what we installed earlier, which is going to be our Babel plugin transform ES 2015 modules AMD. So I'm going to come in here and say plugins, and then I'm going to pass in an array, and I'm just going to pass in transform ES 2015, and then modules AMD. So we're using the AMD module loader. Now I'm going to come back to my command line window, and I'm going to do, whoops, not Y, gulp dev watch. And that'll go ahead and now compile all of our modules in a way that RequireJS will understand. If we hop back over into our compiled code, we see it's now using AMD. And you can certainly write your AMD stuff by hand if you wanted to. I mean, the syntax is actually really, really straightforward. I wouldn't say it's as straightforward as CommonJS, but AMD is certainly a format that is not scary to do by hand. Now, of course, we don't have to do it by hand because we have AS 2015 module syntax, but if you wanted to, you certainly could. Anyway, our application is now set up and ready to be used with RequireJS. So I'm going to pop open index.html, and I'm just going to write this file from top to bottom, and I'll talk about what I'm doing as we go on. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to load in a style sheet. I'm going to say link rel equals style sheet. The href is going to be our jQuery UI theme. So I'm going to say /lib jQuery UI themes UI darkness jQuery. Oh, that's fun. Hopefully I won't explode during this video. UI darkness jQuery and then dash UI.css, and I'll complete that line there. So that's going to be, again, lib jQuery UI themes UI darkness jQuery UI CSS. Now, the reason I'm not including it like this, or didn't include this in the main example, was, of course, because we can include CSS from other module loaders. We're not going to be including CSS from the RequireJS module loader, however. So that's why we're importing it here in a link element. Okay, there are 3 things you need to do to work with RequireJS. First step, include the runtime. You must include the runtime unless you're including a self-executing bundle. So we'll pop open /lib RequireJS and then require.js, and that'll be our first script. Second, you must configure RequireJS. So I'm going to do script source is config.js. Now this file doesn't exist yet, but it will here momentarily. The last thing we need to do is require in a entry point module. So at this point, RequireJS runtime exists on our page. We can now use the require method to pull in modules. We can also use the define method to define our modules. We've configurized RequireJS with this non-existent config file that we'll create momentarily. The last thing we need to do is tell what to execute. In this case, I'm going to say RequireJS, and I'm going to pass in application. Now, why am I passing in application? Well, application is the entry point module of what I'm wanting to do. And that's going to be the module defined by public scripts application.js. So you might notice 2 interesting things here. First of all, there is no file extension. When using RequireJS, please do not use a file extension. We'll see a exception to this rule a little bit later when we talk about production builds. Due to what I assume is a bug. But in this case, when you work with RequireJS, you are working with modules. So think in terms of modules. Don't think in terms of files. Modules will map to files most of the time, but not always. So what we want to do is we're referring to application as its module name. And its module name is the name of the file minus the extension. Now, second, we're not including a path. That's because we're going to instruct RequireJS that the root of our application is this scripts. The reason that's important is if you recall, inside of our source scripts, when I do my application.js here, I'm importing things relative to this application.js. So what I want is I want I want RequireJS to treat my public scripts folder as the root of our application so that I can simply require an application and not having to worry about what directory it lives in. Some people don't use the scripts folder name. They use a folder name like app, for example, but that's just a convention that's up to you. Okay, so let's go ahead and create our config.js file. I'm going to right-click public, new file, config.js. So right off the bat, you might be wondering something. Why are we not feeding this config.js file through Babel? Why aren't we putting it into our source directory and our source scripts? Well, the answer to that is our config.js file shouldn't be a module. Because if it's a module, then it can't be loaded because require hasn't been configured. So we can't load modules until config is invoked, and so config can't be a module, so we can't run config through Babel. Now, I could certainly go into my Gulp file.js, and I can modify our scripts task here to ignore certain files. I can say, hey, go ahead and run all these scripts through Babel except for our config.js file. But I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to make things unnecessarily complex here. It would be a pretty straightforward Gulp file, but I'm just taking the easy way out right here and just writing our config.js right in our public folder. So our config.js is going to go ahead and configurize RequireJS for us. And again, that is included after we've included in the runtime. So what's going to be the first thing we need to config? For example, if I come in here and open up my dev tools and hit F5, notice we're getting an error. Cannot load application.js. See, it already added that .js extension to it, but it's not looking in the scripts folder. So the first thing I need to tell Require is what my base URL is. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say RequireJS.config. That should surprise nobody that that's the name of the method. And then I'm going to pass in a JavaScript object. Now this object, for now, is simply going to have a base URL property that points to scripts. So that is awesome. Now that we've configurized it, let's hop over here and hit F5 and check out all the errors that just popped up. Now, this is actually a good thing. It's a good thing because we now see, for example, woe is being printed out from our script.js file. Remember, we print out woe there. And we see that we're trying to load things like Lodash and jQuery and jQuery UI, and that's all getting a runtime error. So again, just to really, really, really emphasize this point here, unlike all the modules we've been loading already, for example, this Gulp file brings in require Gulp, we're not working on the file system. When we're in our Gulp file and we execute with Node, we are on the file system. Node knows how to search for a file, so it'll go in Node modules and it'll load in Gulp if it exists. RequireJS runs on the browser. RequireJS has no concept of the file system whatsoever. So when I, inside of my my users controller, for example, say import money from jQuery, RequireJS has no idea what jQuery is. It can't search for it on the file system. All it knows is it's loading a module called jQuery, and that's it. So what's it going to do? It's going to look in our base URL, so it's looking for scripts jQuery. So we need to tell it where jQuery is. How do we do that? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Let's hop back into our config and let's add a new property. And I'm going to pass in a new property called paths, and paths is going to be an object. And then I'm going to say jQuery is ... lib jQuery dist jQuery. Okay, we already have a handful of things to talk about. First of all, I am quoting the key. Now, when we're in JavaScript, quoting the key is optional. I could have simply done jQuery, but I'm quoting it, and you'll see why I'm quoting it in just a moment here, but I'm doing that on purpose. Second of all, we are passing in a path to a module to load. In this case, .. // lib jQuery dist jQuery. So you immediately see right off the bat, the base URL is going to be prepended to whatever module path that we put in here. So we're in scripts, that's our base URL. We have to hop out of scripts into public, then into lib, then into jQuery, then into dist, and then to get jQuery.js. Third thing, no file extension. So again, no file extension is a recurring theme around RequireJS. If you ever see an error like 404 can't load jQuery.js.js, well, that means you put in a file extension somewhere where it shouldn't be, and RequireJS went ahead and appended that JS. Again, in Node, The file extensions for modules are optional. You can either put them in there or you cannot put them in there, but that's because the runtime has access to the file system and can first check for a file with an extension and then finally without an extension. All right, let's load in jQuery UI, and now it should become obvious why I choose to put all of these in quotes. So let's go ahead and do lib jQuery UI jQuery UI. So that's going to be under lib jQuery UI and then the jQuery UI.js file. So the reason I put in those quotes is because these module names aren't necessarily, they're just strings, right? They're not necessarily JavaScript identifiers. jQuery-UI is an invalid JavaScript identifier, so we must quote it in our object. Then to make things all consistent, I quote everything. So that's that stylistic choice for you guys. I just like things being consistent. Let's go ahead and pull in Lodash, which will be lib Lodash Lodash. All right, so let's hop over back into our application, hit F5, and check that out. We have a functional application with jQuery UI being loaded, jQuery being loaded, and Lodash being loaded. So yeah, that is the basics of Require. Just to recap, to use Require, we have 3 steps. We load in RequireJS, we configurize it, and then we require in our entry point module. Now, doing the configuration and loading in our first module can be done on the same line. If, for example, I had moved this RequireJS out into config.js, and then I had deleted these 2 lines, I could have said data-main equals config. And then if I come back here, you see it still works. I prefer not doing it that way. So you'll see a lot of people use the data main. I prefer to not do it that way. I prefer to be a little bit more explicit. Furthermore, I could have done this configuration inside of the HTML page itself, which is a popular thing to do, but I don't do that either for a good reason, and that is we want to be able to reuse this configuration when we do production builds. When we actually go out and tell RequireJS to minify and concatenate our entire application into a single JavaScript file, I want to reuse all of the RequireJS configuration I already have. I don't want to have to rewrite it in the build step. So that's why I have it in a separate file. And again, I like things being more explicit. I don't like using data main because that can change a lot. I find keeping it more consistent like this makes it easier to put in conditional statements to say, okay, if we're in production, load this module. If we're in development, load that module. If we're in production, load this bundle. If we're in development, don't load any bundles, blah, blah, blah. I find the code to be much cleaner when I separate things out like this. It's not going to have a performance impact, and it's not going to cause any issues to do it like this. So do it either way. Use data main, don't use data main, doesn't really matter. So yeah, that's about it. So in the next video, we're going to be talking about shims, or rather how to deal with misbehaving modules. So we'll see you then.